Hello and welcome to Investment Insight. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's break down what's happening in the markets today in a clear and simple way. Last year, American retailers celebrated this really historic milestone.
Right, the big shift in imports.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
U.S. imports of Chinese clothing hit a 22-year low. And I remember everyone cheering, like the headlines were declaring this massive victory for supply chain diversity. The whole dominant narrative became, manufacturing is finally leaving China for places like Vietnam, India, Mexico.
It was definitely the story of the year.
But based on recent analysis, what if I told you that the Made in Vietnam tag on your new shirt is actually, well, it's basically the greatest illusion in modern global trade?
It is a profound illusion, and honestly, it is actively reshaping how the whole world makes things right now.
Yeah.
Because, while all those flashy headlines focus on where a product gets its final stitch or like its final coat of paint, the real story is entirely different.
The hidden mechanism, right?
Yeah, exactly. The hidden economic mechanism is all about who actually controls the raw materials and the robots. That is where the leverage actually lies in the modern global economy.
And that leverage is what economic analysts are now calling the China squeeze. So today, for this deep dive, our mission is to break down exactly what this squeeze is, the mechanics behind how it operates right under our noses, and, most importantly, how you, the everyday beginner American investor, can actually navigate it.
Right, because to really understand this phenomenon, we have to look at how global manufacturing historically functioned. There used to be a very predictable rhythm to how countries industrialized.
Yeah, economists had a specific name for this, didn't they?
They did. They traditionally called this the flying geese model.
Mhm.
It describes how industrialization spreads in this V formation. So, like, in the mid-20th century, Japan was the lead goose in Asia.
Okay.
And as Japan's economy grew and its citizens started demanding higher wages, it naturally transitioned to making high-tech, high-margin products, cars, electronics, advanced machinery.
Because at that point, it just no longer makes financial sense for a wealthy nation to pay its workforce to assemble basic toys or, sew basic T-shirts.
Exactly, which leaves a massive gap in the market. So that lower margin, labor-intensive manufacturing naturally gets handed down to the geese flying right behind them.
The next countries in the formation.
Right. Taiwan and South Korea absorbed that industry next. Then, as they grew wealthier, they handed it down to China and Southeast Asia. The entire engine of global development kind of relies on this premise.
That a leading country will willingly surrender the low-skill manufacturing because they've just priced themselves out of doing it profitably?
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. It's like a family with hand-me-down clothes, right?
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, like the older sibling outgrows the small shirts and naturally passes them down to the younger siblings. But what the data shows here is that China, the older sibling, is growing up, starting this high-tech career, but is completely refusing to pass down the old clothes.
That is exactly what's happening. The natural expectation is that China, our current lead goose, should be handing over the basic manufacturing to developing nations in Africa or Southeast Asia right now.
Which they aren't doing.
No, not at all. I mean, we see China aggressively dominating advanced tech, electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, solar panels. They are clearly securing the high-value future.
Yeah, they're everywhere in the EV space.
But the data from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the PIIE, shows something totally unprecedented. They are calling it the China squeeze, because China is absolutely refusing to surrender the low-margin manufacturing.
They're holding on to it all.
Yeah, they're keeping a fierce grip on textiles, shoes, furniture, basic steel. They are attempting to occupy every single tier of the manufacturing ladder simultaneously.
Which is crazy to think about. How does that squeeze actually work in practice?
Well, the Peterson Institute analysis details how it operates across multiple channels. Basically, China competes aggressively in global export markets. They flood the domestic markets of developing nations with really cheap manufactured goods.
Like they also block stuff coming in, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They simultaneously restrict how much those developing nations can export back into the Chinese consumer market. It systematically starves these developing nations of the breathing room they desperately need to start their own industrialization process.
Okay, but let me challenge that narrative for a second. We just talked about U.S. imports of Chinese clothing hitting a 22-year low in May 2025.
Right, the big milestone.
Yeah. And major American brands have very publicly shifted their purchase orders to Bangladesh and Vietnam. So if the data shows imports directly from China plummeting, Doesn't that prove the flying geese model is functioning exactly as it always has?
It completely creates that exact optical illusion, but when we dig into the actual trade data, we see this crucial distinction between manufacturing and final assembly.
Okay, what's the difference there?
Well, the physical act of sewing a garment together,
Yes.
that is happening in Bangladesh, but the actual fabric, the synthetic fibers, the specialized chemical dyes, the zippers, the buttons.
Ah, the components.
Right. The vast majority of those intermediate materials are still entirely locked inside the Chinese industrial ecosystem. So based on the data, what we are seeing is just the dispersion of final assembly, not the actual relocation of manufacturing.
Wow. So the geographic label on the back of the shirt basically changes just to comply with optics, or maybe
Yeah.
to dodge basic tariffs, but the DNA of the product is identical.
Exactly. A recent analysis from Reuters highlighted this exact dynamic. An American retailer might redirect a massive purchase order to a facility in Mexico.
Right, nearshoring.
But that Mexican facility is frequently just acting as a middleman. They're importing the raw materials from China, doing the final assembly, and then just shipping it right across the border. The heavy lifting of the manufacturing process, where the real money is made, never left Asia.
But wait, if Chinese workers are demanding higher wages now, and the standard of living there is way higher than it was 20 years ago, how does this work?
You mean the cost aspect?
Yeah. If the margins on a basic t-shirt or a steel pipe are just pennies, how does it make economic sense for China to fiercely defend this territory? Why aren't they losing out on price to countries where labor is genuinely a fraction of the cost?
That is the million-dollar question. And the answer is that China's primary weapon is no longer cheap labor. It is extreme, heavily subsidized automation.
Robots.
Exactly. We really have to look at the robotics data from the International Federation of Robotics. In their 2024 data, there were roughly 542,000 industrial robots installed globally.
Okay, over 500,000.
Right. Out of that total, China accounted for 54% of them. That is 295,000 industrial robots installed in a single year, in one single country.
Wait, really? Over half of the entire planet's new industrial robots went to one country.
Yes. And Chinese domestic companies now control 57% of their own internal robotics market. So they aren't even relying on foreign tech to automate anymore.
So they're building the robots that build the stuff.
Exactly. They have evolved from a factory floor reliant on millions of low-paid workers into this hyper-dense, automated, low-cost platform. Because, a robotic arm doesn't ask for a pension or a raise.
Right, it just runs.
Yeah, which allows them to completely absorb the cost of rising human wages and keep the marginal cost of producing a shirt or a solar panel incredibly close to zero.
Okay, but even with robots, setting up that infrastructure requires massive capital expenditure. How does a $50,000 robotic arm ever pay for itself if you were using it to make, like, $3 shirts?
The return on investment comes from this concept economists call supply chain density. Let's look at the textile industry for a second.
Okay.
A recent study in the Journal of Economic Geography analyzed the world's top apparel exporters. They found that the true bottleneck in the global clothing industry isn't the sewing machine, it is the raw material generation.
Making the fabric itself.
Right. By 2022, several of the world's leading clothing export nations were relying on China for over 60% of their textile imports.
Because supply chain density means everything is co-located, right?
Yeah.
Like, if I want to build
Right.
a rival textile factory in Bangladesh, I can't just buy some sewing machines.
No, you need way more than that.
Yeah, I need the raw cotton or the petroleum for synthetic polyester. Then I need the chemical plant to process the dyes, the water treatment facility to handle the toxic runoff, the power grid to run the automated looms 24/7, and the deep water port to ship it out.
Exactly. You've identified the exact mechanism of the squeeze. Co-locating all of that, the extraction, the chemical processing, the automated weaving in one geographic zone creates this compounding efficiency.
That no one else can match.
Right. A standalone factory in another country physically cannot replicate it, regardless of how cheap their human labor is. You simply cannot rival China by setting up a sewing facility in a new country because you still have to buy the raw fabric from them anyway.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. It's basically like buying a made-in-Vietnam Lego set.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
Yeah, like the box says Vietnam because that's where someone snaps the final pieces together. But literally every single plastic brick inside was manufactured and shipped from China. The real money stays with the brick maker.
Exactly. It functions almost exactly like the App Store in the tech sector. China doesn't really care if Vietnam or Mexico builds the app, meaning the final assembled product,
Right.
because China owns the operating system and the App Store itself. They own the raw materials, the chemical plants, the power grid. So no matter who codes the app, the platform owner takes their cut. China is taking the core margin of global manufacturing, regardless of whose name is on the final box.
Man, that is such a clear way to understand the leverage at play here. But wait, if they're automating everything and churning out so much stuff, who is buying it all? I mean, this aggressive automation has to create a massive structural problem, right?
Uh,
Overcapacity.
It is a huge problem. If your automated mega factories are running 24 hours a day to achieve those economies of scale, churning out actual mountains of steel and solar panels, you have to sell them somewhere.
And the U.S. is actively trying to buy less of it.
Mhm.
We're throwing up tariffs left and right. So who is absorbing this absolute tidal wave of manufactured goods?
The global market is absorbing it just through different channels.
Yeah.
Looking at the data, China's trade surplus for 2025 hit a staggering record of $1.189 trillion.
Trillion, wow.
Yes. And while their direct exports to the U.S. dropped by 20% in 2025, their exports to ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia jumped 13.4%. Exports to Africa skyrocketed by 25.8%, and exports to the EU went up 8.4%.
So they didn't slow down production at all.
Not even a little. They simply rerouted the goods. It is basically a massive global game of whack-a-mole.
If the U.S. blocks a port, they just flood a different continent. They are essentially using the rest of the developing world as a pressure release valve for the excess capacity their robots are generating. But, I mean, the West cannot be blind to this.
They aren't. And the diplomatic pushback is escalating really rapidly. Just recently, in late May 2026, the European Union publicly declared that their trade relationship with China is, quote, not sustainable.
Oh, wow. They actually said that publicly.
Yeah, they are actively threatening to restrict Chinese access to their markets, specifically targeting critical bottlenecks like chemicals, metals, and clean energy tech. The EU is even debating legislation that would legally force companies to prove supply chain diversification. The China squeeze is now basically the top agenda item for European industrial policy.
And obviously here in the U.S. under President Trump, the administration is heavily focused on this right now, primarily utilizing tariffs to try and force these supply chains to decouple.
Yes, and the application of those tariffs is expanding in ways that honestly catch a lot of investors off guard. On June 3, 2026, the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, proposed an additional tariff of up to 12.5% on imports from 60 different countries.
Wait, 60 countries? That's not a targeted strike against China. That's a total dragnet.
It is a dragnet. The stated justification focuses on a lack of sufficient action against forced labor. But if you examine the list of targeted nations, it includes India, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam. Even the EU and the UK are facing a 10% proposal.
That's huge.
It represents a massive shift in trade policy. It is no longer just a simple mandate to punish China. It is a mandate forcing the entire global supply chain to prove exactly where its components originate, down to the granular level.
But let me push back on the effectiveness of that strategy for a second.
Yeah.
If the raw materials, the DNA of the products, all inherently come from China anyway because of that supply chain density we talked about, aren't these new USTR tariffs just a massive, complicated tax on the American consumer?
That is a very valid point.
Right, because it feels like we aren't actually hurting the Chinese industrial base. We are just making compliance a logistical nightmare and ultimately hurting our own wallets at the checkout counter.
Your concern highlights the exact friction point in global trade right now. Proving the origin of every thread and screw is incredibly expensive, and enforcing these tariffs is notoriously difficult because the price advantage of Chinese intermediate materials is just too tempting for intermediary countries to ignore.
Yeah, because the margins are so tight everywhere else. A factory in India or Vietnam is financially incentivized to find a loophole rather than buy more expensive non-Chinese materials.
Exactly. And we saw a glaring example of this in India recently in April 2026. The data revealed that cheap Chinese finished steel completely flooded the Indian domestic market, hitting a 2-year high.
Really, even with everything going on.
Yes. This Chinese hot-rolled coil was entering the market at $11 to $37 cheaper per ton than India's own domestically produced steel.
Wow. And in the commodities market, $37 a ton isn't just a slight discount. That is an insurmountable advantage that will literally bankrupt domestic producers. But doesn't India have its own import tariffs to prevent exactly that kind of dumping?
They do, absolutely. But global supply chains are incredibly fluid. The Chinese steel slipped through the net using various logistical mechanisms.
Like what?
While sometimes producers make minor modifications, like adding a specific alloy to reclassify the steel under a totally different customs code to secure a tax exemption.
Oh, that's sneaky.
Yeah, and other times, the steel is physically transshipped. It gets routed through a country like Vietnam just to obscure its origin before finally arriving in India. It really demonstrates the profound difficulty of blocking these goods once they enter the bloodstream of global commerce.
So as an American investor listening to this, someone trying to build a resilient portfolio and looking at the data, this sounds incredibly daunting.
It definitely can be.
Right. If the Made in Vietnam label is frequently just a mirage, and simply buying stock in a China Plus One manufacturing firm in Mexico doesn't actually guarantee they aren't totally reliant on Chinese raw materials, how do you actually allocate capital without getting crushed by these expanding 60-country tariffs?
Well, it requires looking past the superficial geography of final assembly and focusing on structural leverage. Based on recent analysis, the institutional investor playbook essentially relies on three specific strategies.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, stop looking for companies that are simply not China and start looking for genuine supply chain independence.
Okay, walk me through how that actually looks on a balance sheet. What am I looking for?
Let's say an apparel brand issues a press release celebrating their brand new sewing operations in Mexico, but then their supply chain disclosures show they still source all their synthetic fabrics from Shenzhen.
Right, the Lego brick problem.
Exactly. That company remains highly vulnerable to U.S. tariffs and sudden supply shocks. The smart money is hunting for companies that are actively internalizing their raw material production.
Taking control of the whole process.
Right. You want the electric vehicle manufacturer that isn't just assembling cars in Ohio, but is actively funding lithium processing facilities in North America or securing their own independent chemical supply lines in Europe.
You want the company building their own app store, not just the one coding a new app.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, what is the second strategy?
Invest in the bottlenecks, because for developing nations to legitimately compete with China's automated megafactories, they desperately need foundational infrastructure.
Right, the basics.
A company cannot simply drop a factory into a developing region. They need a reliable power grid to run the machines, industrial real estate with proper water treatment for manufacturing runoff, and heavy-duty roads to actually transport the goods.
This goes back to those compounding efficiencies we talked about earlier. They literally have to build the density from scratch.
Precisely. And as a result, massive amounts of capital are flowing into Indian and Southeast Asian deepwater ports, localized power grids, and logistics networks.
Oh, that makes sense.
These infrastructure companies basically function as the toll booths of the new global economy. As trade routes physically rearrange themselves to bypass tariffs, the entities that own the new roads and ports capture all the value.
If you know the traffic is being forced onto a new highway, buy the toll booth. That is a great rule of thumb. And the third strategy.
The third strategy often catches people completely off guard. Don't ignore the Chinese automation sector itself.
Wait, really? Even with the sweeping tariffs, the EU pushback, and the USTR dragnet, you are saying everyday investors should look at Chinese robotics.
We have to follow the mechanism of their survival strategy. China's main method for defeating these tariffs and maintaining their global squeeze is hyperautomation. They basically have no choice but to continue purchasing and deploying robotics at a staggering pace to keep their production costs artificially low.
Right, because if prices go up, the whole model breaks.
Exactly. Therefore, the global ecosystem of companies that manufacture industrial software, precision robotic joints, factory automation sensors, advanced power management equipment, they are seeing massive tailwinds. These companies are the direct beneficiaries of China's mandate to automate at all costs.
So to synthesize this for the investor listening, basically, don't invest in the guy putting the sprinkles on the cupcake. Invest in the company building the oven, or the port shipping the flour, or the companies manufacturing the very robotic arms that are driving this massive shift in the first place. You want to own the mechanics of the supply chain, not the final label on the box.
That is the exact mindset required here. It is really about identifying who holds the structural leverage in a complex system rather than who happens to temporarily be holding the finished goods.
Man, this completely rewires how you look at the tags on your clothes,
Mhm.
the components in your car, and honestly, all the headlines about shifting global trade. Before we wrap up today's deep dive, what is the one big, lingering thought you want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, we are currently watching the US and Europe construct these incredibly complex walls of tariffs designed to keep Chinese components out of their markets. But the provocative question we have to ask ourselves is this: are we actually rebuilding our own domestic manufacturing independence? Or, by pushing final assembly to countries like Vietnam and Mexico while the raw materials stubbornly remain in China, are we simply forcing corporations to add a logistical middleman? Because if it is just a middleman, ultimately we are making everyday American consumers pay a massive premium for the exact same Chinese-made parts.
Wow. Are we building true economic independence, or are we just paying a middleman tax for the exact same underlying materials? That is a phenomenal question to leave on, and it perfectly encapsulates why looking past the headlines is so critical. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. Understanding the invisible architecture of global supply chains and seeing the robotics behind the curtain is what truly makes you a sharper, more informed investor. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button.